All attendees are in listen-only mode.
How many people normally show up that actually say they will? People are starting to roll in.
Yeah, they're rolling. Yeah. Welcome to those who are here a bit early. Just to let you know, you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You can send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We'll collect them and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Yeah, 60 people signed up, so usually about half show up. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Sidra. I'm the coordinator of the Immigrant and Refugee Communities Neighbors, Friends, and Families campaign at OCASI, and I'm here with Huda Hassan. Huda Hassan is a writer, researcher, and teacher based in Toronto. Exploring themes of culture, community, and power in her writing, her work has appeared in Hazlitt, The Fader, Quill and Choir, BuzzFeed, Gawker, The National Post, and more. In 2015 and 16, she worked with Complex Media as a news writer. Huda has delivered keynote speeches, workshops, panels, and lectures at the Toronto International Film Festival, Women's Health Centre, McGill University, Daniel Spectrum, University of Toronto, York University, and more. In 2017, alongside Akua Benjamin, Huda was a keynote speaker at the University of Toronto's Black Grad Celebration, the first of its kind in Canadian history. She has appeared as a cultural commentator on CBC's Metro Morning, CBC's The Current, CTV News' Culture Shock, and CTV's show Pop Life. Occasionally sharing her creative writing, Huda opened for Somali poet Warsan Shire at the Centre for Social Innovation in Toronto in 2011. Her creative writing and photography were published in Basodi in 2012, which is an anthology of works by Black artists and academics in Toronto. Her photography has been exhibited in the Creatures Creating Gallery in 2011. In 2017, Huda was featured on Flair's list of incredible 100 millennial women in Canada. She is currently working on her PhD and teaching at the University of Toronto. So I'll leave it to Huda now to share her webinar with you all. Enjoy.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Supporting Somali Survivors of Gender-Based Violence. My name is Huda Hassan, and I am a feminist writer, researcher, and critic based in Toronto. Sidra already introduced me, thankfully. I'm also the daughter of refugees and the daughter of a mother whose career has been rooted in gender-based violence. I actually grew up with a mother who has and still works at a women's shelter, and I kind of informally and formally received a lot of my knowledge around this topic through that process. I am also a survivor of gender-based violence, and these are the different locations of knowledge I'm bringing to this conversation that are within and against traditional knowledge production around conversations concerning gender-based violence. So this webinar is organized and supported by OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, and we're based in Toronto right now. I do want to say this is my first webinar. I am typically used to having a conversation with people where I can actually see them and interact with them. So I am slightly nervous. I do want to admit that this is my first time trying something like this, but I am also very excited. So today we're going to be talking about better ways to support survivors of gender-based violence in the Somali community. And I want to emphasize that this community is a Black, Muslim, and refugee demographic. If you're watching this, you most likely are a frontline service provider in the immigrant and refugee sector, as well as the gender-based violence sector. So settlement workers, shelter staff, employment counselors, and so on. You may also be a community member at large who is interested in better understanding how to deal with survivors of gender-based violence in these communities. So to all of you, I'd like to say welcome. Okay. So my three objectives for today are to help you learn about the unique experiences of the Somali diaspora in Canada, which, as I said, is the largest Black, Muslim, and refugee demographic. To help you learn how to better support and meet the needs of Somali survivors of gender-based violence. And thirdly, to help you better understand the systemic structures of Canada that shapes the barriers of this community. If I'm moving too fast through the slides, please feel free to make a comment in the chat section. I'm occasionally checking there just in case there's any sort of feedback you'd like to give me. So this webinar is very specific to Somalis in Canada, which is the largest African diaspora in Canada according to Statistics Canada. Somalis are one of the largest single ethnic groups in Africa and occupy both Somalia, Djibouti, parts of Ethiopia, and Kenya in the Horn of the continent. A major identifier amongst Somalis is the religion of Islam, which has served as a form of unification amongst this demographic that does largely operate by clan divisions or clan identities. Somalis began to migrate to Canada, the United States, and London, and other locations outside of Africa long before the country's political and ecological collapse in 1991. However, a majority of this community did arrive in Canada in the late 1980s and early 1990s in result of the country's civil war in the Horn of Africa. Somalis are predominantly located in Toronto, Ottawa, followed by Edmonton. So gender-based violence is a global phenomenon rooted in heteropatriarchal structures that actively disempowers women, girls, and non-binary folks across the globe. And it's further perpetuated through policy, the justice system, patriarchal and cultural understandings of gendered violence, lack of resources and support, and so on. So for instance, when I say that gendered violence is further perpetuated through the justice system, in the US, only 6% of rapists face incarceration. Gender-based violence is enacted in public or private spaces that is directed at individuals based on their gender identities and is often enacted on those who are often pretty vulnerable. It's important to note that we should use a language of gender-based violence opposed to violence against women because of how exclusionary that phrasing is. When we say violence against women, we are insinuating something that is cis woman specific, and I think that's very dangerous. According to Ontario's Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, gender-based violence can be defined as any form of violence that is based on an individual's gender, their gender expression, or gender identity, and is intended to control, humiliate, or harm the individual. Violence based on gender is an issue that affects diverse populations, including women, Indigenous persons, LGBTQI2S folks, racialized women, Black women, folks who are non-status, youth, persons with disabilities, and seniors. Gendered violence is not all the same thing. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, psychological. It could include psychological abuses, coercion, threats, and/or economic or educational deprivation. Although women and girls are primarily affected by gender-based violence, it can also impact anyone despite their geographical locations, their socioeconomic background, race, religion, gender identity, and sexuality. Gender-based violence can happen in the private or the public sphere. It can happen in kitchens, bedrooms, streets, markets, boardrooms, or even in refugee camps. It can include street harassment, for instance, groping, whistling, or unwanted attention in public spaces, and marital rape and intimate partner violence. Gender-based violence has serious consequences on the survivor that can be physical, so unwanted pregnancies, unsafe abortions, STI transmissions. It could be mental, so isolation and depression. Survivors often suffer from PTSD and other things associated with mental health. It could be economic. Survivors might struggle with achieving economic prosperity due to stigma or physical and psychological trauma caused by violence. And all this can very much play into the social well-being of survivors. So when dealing with survivors, it's important for us to learn a survivor-centered approach. This requires providing safety and confidentiality, respect, and providing health services. And no matter what, as a frontline worker, survivors always need to be centered. That means we must provide them a listening ear that is free of judgment and be prepared to provide them accurate and up-to-date information on services available to them. Always allow survivors to make their own choices. When dealing with Black, Muslim, and refugee demographics, it's also important to utilize an anti-racist and intersectional framework. So we're going to call this a feminist anti-racist framework. I apologize that I keep coughing. As frontline workers, it is important that you examine attitudes and actions through the lens of equity, access, and social justice. So the ideas that I'm about to work through here are grounded in a Black feminist critique, and I'm working with the theories and knowledge production of individuals like Kimberly Crenshaw, the Combahee River Collective, Audre Lorde, Barbara Christian, Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, and also several Black Muslim feminists based here in Toronto, who I will be citing at the end of this presentation. So many of us might be familiar with an anti-oppression framework. Anti-oppression refers to the strategies, theories, and actions that challenge socially and historically built inequalities and injustices that are ingrained in our systems and institutions by policies and practices that allow for certain groups to dominate other groups. Some of these inequalities include, but are not limited to, racism, xenophobia, classism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, ableism, transphobia, and ageism. An anti-racist framework, however, is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by examining the power imbalances between Black, Indigenous, and racialized peoples versus non-racialized white people. So these imbalances become unearned privileges that non-racialized or white people benefit from, while Black and Indigenous and racialized people do not get to benefit from. Anti-racism is an active way of seeing and being in the world in order to transform it. Because racism occurs at all levels and spheres of society, and it can function and produce and maintain exclusionary levels and spheres, anti-racism, education, and activism is absolutely necessary in all aspects of society. So in other words, it does not happen exclusively in the workplace, in the classroom, or in selected aspects of our lives. So a person who's practicing anti-racism as a framework is someone who works to become aware of, one, how racism affects the lived experiences of people of color and Indigenous people and Black people, how racism is systemic and has been part of many foundational aspects of society throughout history and can be manifested in both individual attitudes and behaviors, as well as formal unspoken policies and practices within institutions. And 3, how white people participate, often unknowingly, in racism. You can actually find a white privilege checklist that's pretty useful, which is created by Peggy McIntosh and Paul Cavall. And it supports white people in learning how whiteness, often without them recognizing it, shapes their place in society and its impacts. So anti-oppression based facilitation is rooted in an anti-racist framework, anti-oppression based facilitation that is rooted in an anti-racist framework should require the 3 things. Recognizing that issues of power and privilege are present in all structures and therefore manifest in groups. An anti-oppression model envisions a world that is characterized by freedom from all structures of domination and privilege. So it integrates the realms of micro and macro practices and recognizes the complex interconnections between the person and the political, or the person and the state. It also provides practical frontline assistance to those who are injured by the oppressive social order and to engage in diverse efforts that are aimed at change that will transform oppressive systems. I want to emphasize the word transform. I think that's a key word here. I want to briefly address concepts in relation to anti-racism. We often hear of the concept or the policy of multiculturalism, and I want us to look at anti-racism in comparison to multiculturalism. So multiculturalism as a concept is government-sponsored, whereas anti-racism is not. Multiculturalism focuses on inclusion through tolerating different people, whereas anti-racism takes actual direct responsibility for ending racism. Multiculturalism recognizes different groups, but also places people at similar playing fields, whereas anti-racism challenges the category of whiteness and the normativity that is associated with it. Multiculturalism recognizes that we're all equal, whereas anti-racism examines power, it centers power. Multiculturalism is rooted in education for racial harmony, whereas under anti-racism, racism is understood to be institutional and not just about behavior, it's structural. Multiculturalism attempts to celebrate different cultures, whereas anti-racism actually challenges stereotypes, tokenism, stealing, appropriation. It actually tackles the violence. Multiculturalism can be seen as a new phenomenon due to global immigration to Canada, whereas anti-racism actually addresses the histories that have helped us arrive to this location, this moment, where structures of power is completely imbalanced. And lastly, multiculturalism understands that culture and ethnicity is definable and unchangeable concepts, whereas anti-racism challenges assumptions of race and racialization of groups. It's always important to center intersectionality in our understandings of gender-based violence in the Somali community. So at the core of a feminist anti-racist framework is the concept of intersectionality, which is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And it illuminates dynamics that have been ignored in feminist theorizing. The word first appeared in her article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. And in this paper, she explores 2 forms of gender-based violence enacted against women, which is domestic violence and rape, and how these experiences are rooted in the intersection of racism and sexism for Black women. If you're a frontline worker dealing with these topics, dealing with gender-based violence, I highly, highly suggest that you take time to read this paper. I think it's very, very instrumental to this conversation. So as per Crenshaw, structural intersectionality affects how women of color or Black women experience domestic violence or rape qualitatively differently from the ways that white women experience it at the hands of the state. Political intersectionality addresses the limited visibility of women of color or Black women in feminist and anti-racist laws and policies, which actually impact the experience of survivors. So these are some key tenets for intersectionality that we've developed for you. Human lives cannot be explained by taking into account single categories such as gender, race, and socioeconomic status. So people's lives are multidimensional, they're complex, and their lived realities are shaped by different factors and social dynamics operating together. The relationships and power dynamics between social locations and processes are linked. So they can change over time and be different depending on geographic settings. Multi-level analysis that link individual experiences to broader structures and systems are crucial for revealing how power relations are shaped and experienced. And lastly, intersectionality is explicitly oriented towards transformation, building coalitions among different groups and working towards social justice. I'm actually going to leave that slide up for you just a little bit longer in case anyone wants to take notes from that or view that a little bit more. So I want to emphasize that intersectionality is rooted in Black women politics. That's absolutely fundamental to understand when we're articulating intersectionality. It isn't just a fancy way of talking about complexity and difference. Intersectionality through Kimberly Crenshaw's work specifically names Black women politics in the context of gender-based violence. So intersectionality needs to be considered as a praxis. It's both knowledge production and emancipatory politics. Although it can be applied to different social groups, we need to understand that it can never ever erase the operation of race. I also want to bring up that Black women feminists have been articulating the idea of intersectionality long before Kimberly Crenshaw actually coined the term. This is something that we've been trying to articulate for decades. You can find in Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. I've just pulled some quotes from here, from that text, as well as from the work of Bell Hooks. The ways in which they articulate intersectionality without the usage of the term intersectionality. So the first one says, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. That's by Audre Lorde. The second one is, women do not eradicate difference to feel solidarity. We do not need to share common oppression to fight equally to end all oppression. And that's Bell Hooks. And lastly, by Audre Lorde again, refusing to recognize difference makes it impossible to see the different problems and pitfalls facing us as women. I just want to remind you that you do have the opportunity to ask questions, which I will be answering at the end of this webinar. And if you wanted to contribute in any way to this conversation, please feel free to type in the chat. I am periodically checking that. So when dealing with Somali survivors of gender-based violence, it is important to utilize a trauma-informed approach. So there are different definitions of trauma. Today, I'm defining trauma as an experience of perceived threat to life or real threat to life that results from a single or repeated event that threatens to overwhelm a person's ability to cope and or to integrate the experience. So when the traumatic stressors are interpersonal, meaning premeditated, planned, perpetuated in relationships of care, it is damaging and constitutes very complex trauma. Experiencing and or witnessing domestic violence is also a form of complex trauma. Trauma could further develop into experiences with severe mental health. It is associated with a range of adaptive responses and patterns many of them unconscious, that are later diagnosed as psychiatric disorders. And I think that's very, very important for us to remember. Developing a trauma-informed approach to gender-based violence allows us to attend to survivors' emotional and physical safety. So using this approach supports survivors recovering from the psychological traumas of gender-based violence. A trauma-informed approach is a strengths-based framework that is, one, grounded in an understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma. Two, it emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers and survivors. And three, it creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. So using this approach recognizes the prevalence of trauma and is sensitive to and informed by the impacts of trauma on the emotional, psychological, and social well-being of individuals and communities. I want to remind folks, especially those who are frontline workers, that when you're dealing with Somali survivors of gender-based violence, it's really important to understand that these individuals may be dealing with or coping with more than one trauma at a time. Frontline workers also need to be aware of potential barriers when serving victims or survivors who are Black Muslim refugees and some of the many internalized stigmas survivors of gender-based violence from these communities may be navigating. One of those things might be shame. Shame is a very big one, I think, that a lot of survivors of gender-based violence have to endure. And this can be based on cultural norms, faith-based systems, internalized patriarchal understandings around gender-based violence. But what we must understand is that these articulations of shame around gendered violence is communicated through cultures across the globe. Shame is often rooted in culture, religion, patriarchal understandings of gender-based violence, and this plays a significant factor into whether or not victims feel safe coming forward. Survivors take significant risks coming forward that can further endanger them, and some of those risks include, but are not limited to, financial and socioeconomic security and safety, but also exclusion from their communities, the places that they feel the most safe, especially being in a vulnerable place if you are a refugee. Frontline workers need to be sensitive to the different locations that may be impacting a survivor's articulations of gender-based violence, and must also do the work to understand where they're coming from. We must use a survivor-centered approach when dealing with Somali survivors of gender-based violence, and this requires providing safety, confidentiality, respect, and providing health services. But no matter what, I think what's most important is that survivors always need to be centered. We need to provide them a listening ear that is free of judgment and be prepared to provide them accurate and up-to-date information on services available to them. And most importantly, we always need to allow survivors to make their own decisions and understand that they have agency and respect their agency. So just a summary of what we've talked about briefly today. Gender-based violence is a global phenomenon rooted in heteropatriarchal structures. So that actively disempowers women, girls, non-binary folks across the globe through policy, the justice system, various justice systems, patriarchal cultural understandings of gendered violence, lack of resources, support, and so on. When dealing with Black Muslim and refugee demographics, it is important to use an anti-racist and intersectional framework or a feminist anti-racist framework. Anti-racism is an active way of seeing and being in the world in order to transform it. And it does not happen exclusively in the workplace, in the classroom, or in selected aspects of our lives. This is actual transformative work that we need to do internally as well as externally. Intersectionality is a praxis that is both knowledge production and emancipatory politics, and it is not about just complexity and difference. It actually names Black women's experiences. At the center of intersectionality is race. It's also important to use when dealing with Somali survivors or demographics that are Black Muslim refugees to use a trauma-informed approach. So developing a trauma-informed approach to domestic violence allows for us to attend to survivors' emotional and physical safety. And using this approach supports survivors recovering from the psychological traumas of gender-based violence. And lastly, frontline workers need to be aware of potential barriers when serving survivors who are Black Muslim refugees, and some of the many internalized stigmas that survivors might be dealing with or navigating. Using a survivor-centered approach is absolutely useful. I also want to say, sometimes we don't always have the training or the prep to have the right answers. And at the core of providing radical care or radical support is asking individuals, what do you need? We need to understand that survivors are their own individuals with their own agency, with their own set of needs. We do need to experience. We do not need to experience gender-based violence in order to be an ally or in solidarity with survivors or those who've experienced gender-based violence directly or indirectly. I like this quote by Leela Watson, who is an academic, artist, and activist. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you are here because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. I think this quote by Mia McKenzie, who's an activist and feminist based in the US, is also very useful. Real solidarity does not require an audience to what a good ally you are. Real solidarity isn't worn like a name tag. And I want to end off this presentation by emphasizing that we can talk about these things, but what's really important is how we move forward and how we act upon making this world or this place a better location for survivors of gender-based violence from these particular localities or identities, to work through, to be able to arrive at a safe place. I also want to end this off by listing just a small list of Black Muslim women who are based in Toronto, who are some who are associated with organizations, some who are not, who are doing really, really instrumental work around this topic. And if you are looking for more people to consult or to further develop your understanding or your analysis or your education around this topic, I would highly, highly recommend these people to talk to. Mona Udbi Ali is now a professor in the US, but she is a Toronto activist, writer, and academic. Hawiya Ige, who works for Ontario Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, has talked about gender-based violence and other issues pertaining to immigrants and refugees from particularly a Black Muslim demographic. Rania Al-Mugabar is an activist, writer, anti-oppression educator, and a multidisciplinary artist and organizer based in Toronto. And Marian Dalal is a worker at Family Outreach and Response Program who works extensively with the Somali diaspora, particularly pertaining to mental health and gender-based violence. And she is also my mother. And I also want to name, this one's outside of Ontario, but I think is a very instrumental and useful collective that I've been learning a lot from, the Third Eye Collective. I would highly recommend checking them out if you're interested in exploring and understanding new ways of transformative justice. And that is it for today. If you had any questions, you can type them into the question box or the chat box. Oh, I see a couple have posted here. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to look through these questions now before I get to them. Please feel free to add some if you'd like. I'm going to answer a few today before I wrap up. In the interim, before I answer some of these questions, if you would like to contact me, my email is down on the bottom left corner, hudamin@gmail.com. I am more than happy to answer more questions in detail there. If you are looking for more resources, I love sharing resources. I am a researcher and archivist, so please feel free to do that. And I'm also available on socials. That is a shameless plug. But I do like actively tweeting about these topics on Twitter. So please follow me there if you care to do so. Okay, I'm just trying to see how these questions pop up in a moment. Okay, I'm going to try to read this one out loud. Ooh, it's a long one. Okay, as with all frameworks, theories, anti-oppression as a method of seeing, this is a question that somebody asked. As with all frameworks, theories, anti-oppression as a method of seeing the world does come with limits. As a person living in the world and as a frontline social service worker, I have noticed that the practical limits of anti-oppression is that it does absolve marginal groups from personal responsibility. Okay. Even as a racialized person, I have noticed that justice work does de-emphasize personal accountability. Absolutely, I agree with that. My question is, how does one as a service provider balance systemic injustice with personal accountability? Are there materials that discuss these complexities? Okay, that's a really good question. So even as a racialized person, I've noticed that justice work does de-emphasize personal accountability. This is something that I continuously try to address myself. I think that we need to understand, for us to see any sort of transformation on a state level, so through policies, institutions, I always like to think of that process happening in steps. I don't think that we can make any sort of systemic changes without making any communal changes. So changes that are rooted in community. And I don't think that that work can ever be done without internally addressing these conversations. So as someone who has experienced gendered violence, I noticed in my own experiences that I was re-articulating internally a lot of violent ideas about gender-based violence in my body. I started to recognize the many ways that I have internalized patriarchal articulations of how my body gets to move through this world as a cis woman versus other bodies. So I guess my answer to that question is doing the internal work, if that makes sense. I don't think that we can. That might be a weird example that I'm giving, but I take that realization or that knowledge into my work as an activist and as a writer, understanding that I need to address power, the ways that I've internalized power in order to challenge power on the external. I hope that makes sense. Let me see if there's another question. Okay. Sorry that I'm taking so long in between these. I'm just trying to scroll and find the questions. Okay, this was just a comment from Zainab Ahmed. Appreciate this. Very validating. Thank you for your work from a Somali survivor of GBV. Thank you so much for that. I got another question from Hashi Ahmed. Are there any volunteer opportunities in this area? I don't have an answer to that right now. I will talk to the folks here at OCASI. Please feel free to email me on the bottom right. You can grab it from the bottom left corner. I'll have a better answer for you for that later today, if that's cool. And I'm just going to take one more question because now I'm seeing that there's more. Let's see. Okay, this one's about multiculturalism. This question asks, do you think notions focusing on multiculturalism are so entrenched that we cannot change dominant narratives? Do you think notions of focusing on multiculturalism are so entrenched that we cannot? I kind of have a very broad answer to this question. I think that multiculturalism in Canada is used strategically as a national narrative to insinuate that something's being done, that policies, that parts of institutions are addressing the various demographics that take up this country and that live here. But I think it's also deeply violent because there's a lot of erasure that happens within multiculturalism. Often when we're talking, multiculturalism is often used as a buzzword. It's often used as a buzzword to imply some sort of inclusion, to imply some sort of acknowledgement of the various demographics and people that make up this country, whereas anti-racism actually addresses how so many of us have arrived here. It addresses the histories of colonization and enslavement and the fact that we live in a settler state, and at the center of it, it understands power. I hope that's a answer to your question. Should I take more?
Sure, if you want. I also wanted to say there are volunteer opportunities to work.
Okay. So
Zainab,
I think that question was by Hashi. Well, so you're going to get your answer today instead of having to email me. Hashi Ahmed. She asked any volunteer opportunities in this area.
Yes, Hashi, there are volunteer opportunities to be a peer champion with OCASI, so you can be trained in having conversations on gender-based violence and go out and host educational events in your community. So that opportunity is here. And yeah, if you send an email to the organizer of this webinar, I can connect you with more information about that. Any other questions?
I think I got all of them.
You got all of them? Great,
yeah.
Great.
Okay, cool.
Wonderful.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I hope that this process was informative. This was my first webinar. If you have any additional questions, please contact me or Sidra Adokasi, and this will be online soon.
Yes, we have a recording of it, which we're going to upload online. Yeah, great.
Have a great day, everyone.